Thank you very much. Thank you. Good evening, all. And let me thank you for that very gracious and generous introduction. And thank you very much for your very warm reception. And let me thank the Institute and Ralph and everybody associated with the program for the invitation to join you this evening. Believe it or not, I was just telling a few people at dinner, throughout my public service career, the one environment that I found the most challenging, the most enjoyable, and one that I really, even today, feel good about engaging in is the academic environment. I love going to schools, having conversations with students, because I've always felt government is about tomorrow. Government is truly, at any level of government, you make decisions today in government that are about tomorrow, that are about the future. And students that don't really think about it too much, but you've got more of a future ahead of you than I have ahead of me. It's this thing called the calendar. And so when you have an opportunity to discuss government with those who will be affected in a positive or an adverse way by the decisions made today in government, it's very provocative. It's very enjoyable. So I appreciate the fact that you take the time to engage, perhaps in a conversation, a little Q&A when we're done. I'm grateful to have the opportunity to address you now as a private citizen. I've held a lot of jobs in public service. Some people said your resume suggests you can't hold one down. The first job I had was an infantry soldier in Vietnam. Not the greatest of employment, but there's probably nothing of which I'm more proud than to wear the uniform of my country. I've been a prosecutor. I was also a defense attorney. But when you run for office, the public doesn't have normally a warm, fuzzy embrace for people who defend criminals. But boy, if you put them in jail, they love you. So I didn't emphasize the defense stuff. I really emphasized I was a prosecutor, enjoyed that. And then a series of elected offices, and concluding with assistant to the President for Homeland Security and Secretary. The transition from really a public servant to the private sector has been somewhat interesting. The biggest challenge, I must tell you, and really the only challenge, because I've been looking for it for some time, was transportation. Because when I was governor, the state police provided the wheels. They took care of me and the family, took me wherever I want to go. When I was assistant to the president or the secretary, it was the Secret Service. So I just come out the front door, hop in the car, and away I'd go. Well, the day after I retired, I went out the front door. There was nobody there, and my family had both cars, so I was stuck. Just kidding. Until I decided, I know the students will appreciate this, I want to talk to some of the older folks in the crowd. How many of you, with the children my age, they were in high school at the time, they're now college, how many of you have ever borrowed a car from your kids? I remember I asked my son, because he and my daughter were going to high school, and we had a car for them. They went together. And I said, hey, Tommy, Dad wants to borrow the car. I got to go to the mall. I got to get some stuff. And I got the look. Like, hey, it's my car. No, it's not your car. I'm paying the lease arrangements. So he flipped me the keys. And you probably did this to your parents if they were borrowed a car. I got that little smirk, a little smile. I know he's going to say something. He said, Dad. I said, yes, son? Two things. I'm listening carefully. Be respectful. Watch where you park it. And don't forget to fill it up with gas if you drive it around too much. The other challenge I've had was in the air. I now fly commercially. I was a scholarship student to Harvard. As a scholarship student, a father who worked 2 jobs, I worked in the summer. I didn't fly back and forth from Erie, Pennsylvania to Boston. I took the Greyhound bus. Whew. And I swore when I got done with college I would never take a Greyhound bus again. Now I'm flying Greyhound buses, but they got wings. But I've been pulled through secondary screening. That's right, the first Secretary of Homeland Security. We set up the Transportation Security Administration. I have been pulled into secondary screening 24 times. If they do it, and we'll talk a little bit maybe about risk management, they're just doing their jobs. I mean, so it may be inconvenient, it may be time consuming, just tell them thanks. I mean, they're just doing their jobs because the political world has not embraced the notion that there are other things we could be doing at our airports that could reduce the stress on the frequent flying public. But anyhow, that's another story. But I remember being in Charlotte. There's a plexiglass lane for secondary screening. Some fellow who was just going through the regular screening was putting things back in his coat pocket, and he took a quick glance at the plexiglass lane and saw me in it. And I was watching very carefully. He kind of looked. He just started laughing. That's the only adjustment. The nice thing about being a private citizen, and we're going to do that tonight, I can have very candid conversations with you. I can tell you what's in my heart and in my head, and I don't have to be nuanced about it. When you're governor, you want to make news. You drive an agenda. I was governor for 6 years, 9 months, and 5 days. I love being governor of Pennsylvania. Best job I ever had. When you're assistant to the president for Homeland Security or a cabinet secretary, you're not to make news. You get the job done. You're going to appear on the Sunday shows. You're going to do the talk shows, but you don't set policy. You don't drive initiatives. And if you do so, you do it quietly. And frankly, you have to be much more nuanced in your conversation about subjects that come your way. And so I welcome the opportunity to be a little less nuanced and a little more expansive tonight in my remarks to you, not so much about the test of our times, which is a good way to get into our conversation, but about issues that I think implicated in that test are even relevant today, unfortunately almost relevant as it relates to Fort Hood and other events that are going on. On September 11th, I was at home. My mother was in the hospital. Took some jelly donuts down to her in the morning. I like to garden. I was gardening in my home. I was going to go fly back to Harrisburg later that day. Twin Towers, Pentagon, Flight 93. So later that day, I won't bore you with details. I end up in the back of an old Army Chinook. Flew those a lot. Not a lot, but I flew it in Vietnam. The back's down. I'm moving into the Shanksville site, and I expect to see a debris field. You know, after a horrible aviation accident, the camera crews come in, and you see remnants of the plane everywhere, but there were no remnants, folks. Nothing. Big hole. No debris. Several hundred miles an hour at about a 45-degree angle. Boom. That's it. A couple days later, the president called. So we're going to create this new office in the White House. Had a short conversation that day, saw him the next day, accepted the job, was announced that night. Then we wrote the job description. I accepted a job for which there was no description. But again, the president accepted responsibility to lead us during these extraordinary times when there was no game plan to deal with a non-traditional enemy. Think about it for a moment. United States of America, end of the 20th century. Neighbors to the north and south. Canadian border is the longest land, unmanned, unarmed, unmanned border, unsecured border in the world. Friends to the south in Mexico, oceans to the east and west. We thought, in spite of the globalization of communication, that terrorism happened over there, elsewhere around the world. Oh, Timothy McVeigh, homegrown, the blind sheik in 1993, these were aberrations. If you go back at that point in time, and some of you have no reason to remember, but there was a series of events. The barracks bombing in Lebanon, the embassy bombings in Africa, the USS Cole, the 1993 World Trade Center. There were certain things going on out there, and the euphemism was we didn't connect the dots. But there are very few people that thought that the United States of America would be subject to a terrorist attack. 9/11 did not make us more vulnerable, ladies and gentlemen. It just made us more aware of our vulnerabilities. We're not more vulnerable because of that. We're just more aware. What transpired after that, I think, has and will continue to affect our view of our role and in the world and our relationship with other countries for the foreseeable future. I wrote the book to try to convince the reader that the threat's real. They're strategic in their thinking. I went to Shanksville this year. It was 8 years since my first visit. But don't forget, it was 8 years between the first attack on the World Trade Center and the second. They don't set their wristwatches like we do, folks. That Western frame of reference is not part of their mentality. The first public statement bin Laden made after 9/11, crediting himself and his organization Al-Qaeda for the attacks, he referred to an incident that occurred 500 years ago. 500 years ago, that affected the Islamic world. They have a different time frame. They're strategic in their thinking. We also are a little bit naive in this country. You know, we need to understand and better familiarize ourselves with the Muslim world. It comprises about 24% of the world's population. Let's think about that. I talk a little bit about it in the book, and I talk about some prescriptive things I think America should do down the road in order to engage and be more effective in the engagement of that part of the world. Because I don't think the military is the only dimension that we should rely upon to affect the change. I think there are other things we need to do as a country to try to buy in and try to nurture the relationship with Muslim clerics and leaders around the world if we're trying to undermine this philosophy, this ideology. So they're strategic. It's manageable. I also write the book to say, everybody, that's okay. Let's not be breathless about this. We can manage the threat. Let's not hyperventilate. It's real. Let's deal with it. But let's not forget, as a culture, as a society, as a country, we have other responsibilities to each other, and governments have other responsibilities to us. Now, in the process of writing the book, I was able to bring the perspectives of the soldier and Congress. And I'm fairly critical of Congress in some ways, but I can do that. I spent 12 years up there. Well-intentioned people, good institution. I think they've lost their sense of urgency. I think both political parties, as I describe in the book, have tried to use the politics of terrorism to their advantage. I think it's wrong. Terrorism is very much a part and should be a part of the public debate. We should be thinking about how we make ourselves safer. But both parties have tried to use it to gain political leverage, and I'm not comfortable with that notion. There have been other instances in the book that I relate to that I think that both parties did well by the country as it related to terrorism. When we created the department, this leads me into a series of observations I'd like to make for you and with you, and then I think these events are much more interesting to for us to go to a question and answer period. But we would ask ourselves three questions. I would ask myself as secretary, my deputy, but we all understood there were three questions we needed to ask ourselves if we were going to ask America to accept a certain security policy, measure, or approach. Three questions. Will it make us safer? I would hope you'd want me to ask that question. Secondly, what's the economic impact? Now, I don't mean the cost of the technology. That's not what I meant. I believe, and I believed this before I became secretary, I believe it now, I always believe it, that America's future security and America's future prosperity is tied to our ability to build and sustain political and economic and social and humanitarian relationships with the rest of the world. We have to do that if we want to be able to influence events across the board. There are some political isolationists in my party that I think are wrong. It's tough to influence the world if you withdraw from it. There's some economic isolationists in the other party, respected party. Wrong. This whole Buy American nonsense is, in my judgment, is nonsense. I know we got 10% unemployment, but the marketplace is global. The opportunities are global. The forces of globalization, in my mind, have created an opportunity for the whole world to get better informed, better educated, have better health care, have better relationships with one another. It has also created more vulnerabilities. the terrorists fly in. They use the ubiquity of the internet to proselytize and advocate and educate. International finance is a global force. They move money around. So the forces are powerful, they're strong, they're benevolent, and sometimes not benevolent. So what's the economic cost of being an economic isolationist? My view, anyone who thinks that we ought to just simply buy American should be required to divest themselves of everything that has been made elsewhere. They will be homeless, they will be carless, and they'll be wrapped in deer skins. You cannot operate in the world today. Take that battery running your flashlight, not even the battery you have in your BlackBerry or your iPod. There are probably basic ingredients, basic components of that come from 4 or 5 different countries around the world. So you don't want to buy American? Then go without your BlackBerry or your iPod. So I think that second, what's the economic cost? Well, I think we're hurting ourselves because our visa policy, I had a great opportunity to spend some time with some of your fellow students. I really enjoyed our conversations. Some of them are here, some of them are international students. Visa policy. Do I think that America would be better off encouraging more foreign students to come to the United States? Of course, we talked to the president. She wants them all to come to Gettysburg. I do. Why? We're not perfect as a country. We never have been, never will be. We make mistakes along the way. We also have a tendency to correct them once we've identified them. As a country, we are our biggest cheerleaders, but we're also our biggest critics, and that's a good thing. That's a good balance. But it's tougher to get a visa today to come to the United States of America than it was on September 10, 2001. It is. Should it be? I don't think so. I'm willing to take the risk of letting more people into this country. Oh, with some changes, and we're doing a lot better in terms of identifying potential threats and have a lot more information about people. Give you another example, visa policy. How can you be more connected with the rest of the world if you are denying their ability to connect with you? Economically, I know there are companies in the United States that have decided to locate offshore because it's tough to get the engineers who are born or these other people who are born overseas who want to work in the United States. It's tough to get them here. I know they have held conferences and seminars offshore because it's tough to get their employees here. I did something at Cisco one time. John Chambers is a friend of mine. They were going to celebrate success. You like to celebrate success. They invited their employees from around the world. Obviously, they're not all American citizens, but there was like several empty chairs because they couldn't get their visas in time to come here. Is that in our best interest, to make it so difficult to get a visa? There ought to be parameters, there ought to be security concerns, but we need to think about differently about how we issue them. I'll give you another example. General Motors had an assembly plant for one of its cars outside of Detroit. I was sworn in on October 8, 2001. The first anthrax death occurred on October 5, 2001. Over the next couple of weeks, there was the mailings into the Senate, into some of the newsrooms. And so all this is going on. They're writing my job description. We're trying to build the office in the White House. Anthrax is out there. The president called me in after one of our morning meetings and said, you need to do something about fixing our border relationship with our friends in Canada and Mexico. Okay, Mr. President. The orders were fairly generic. We need to do something. We've ramped up security in such a way that is impeding our economic connectivity. It's a problem. Fix it. The conversation lasted a little longer than that, but the orders or the direction from my friend the president were fairly generic. It's a problem. Figure out a way to solve it. Okay, Mr. President. By the way, we were on a first-name basis. I've known the president for a long time. Matter of fact, I remember walking the beach with him up in Kennebunkport, visiting his father up there when he told me he was going to run for president. So we've always had this personal relationship. Everybody got a nickname but me. I'm not grieved about it. I just kind of wondered why. But he always called me Tom or Tommy, and I always called him Mr. President. It worked out just great. Still is now. I called him the other day and said, how you doing, Mr. President? He said, well, I'm doing fine. Well, I won't tell you the rest of the conversation. We had a good conversation. Good. The assembly plant. You drop the chassis in first thing. It's about a 12-hour process. You order the seats from our friends in Canada. They're custom made. They make them, put a chip on them, put them in the truck. It either goes across the Ambassador Bridge or through the Windsor Tunnel. Now remember, we've ramped up security. We have really ramped up security along the border. So we're stopping cars, we're stopping trucks, we're looking at trunks, we're opening back doors. Now the seat's got to be there about hour 8 or 9. What happens in that plant if those seats are in the truck and they're delayed 20 or 24 hours on the bridge trying to get in because we've ramped up security? Nothing happens in the plant. So what's the balance? Did that policy have an economic impact? You bet. So it's finding what make it safer, what are the economic costs? So you've got to balance that a little bit. The third question we asked ourselves, is it consistent with our Constitution and the rule of law? Very important question. It wasn't the Attorney General, but when we looked at things we were going to do, we said, is it consistent with the constitutional rule of law? If you viewed America, and I view America as a product, we like to sell ourselves around the world. America is a great product. We're proud of the product of which we are so much a part. But every product has a brand, and I think our brand in part has to do with our value system. And part of that value system is our Constitution and the rule of law. So I say to myself, is what we were doing consistent with that? I believe the Patriot Act was consistent with it. I believe FISA, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act changes were consistent with it. We can get into those things if you care to during the Q&A period. But Guantanamo, in my judgment, that's current. The debate on Guantanamo, until recently, I think, was misdirected. Because it was, should we or should we not close Guantanamo? That's not the point, in my mind. The branding of America says that we as Americans should find a way to let these people who have been incarcerated there be heard. It's called due process. And you can say, well, they're enemy combatants, they're war fighters. Well, I'm going to tell you, they're not traditional prisoners of war. We pulled them off the battlefield, we put them in Guantanamo. I happen to know some people that were involved in the early interrogation. They told me confidentially, some of those people we should never, ever, ever release. Others, these people concluded, were in the wrong place at the wrong time. And so what the world was saying, and all those protests around the world, wasn't that Guantanamo was the wrong place. The world was saying to us, you Americans, your value system talks about due process. What is the means of adjudicating whether they stay there or not? So it's not a question whether they're in Guantanamo or Illinois or any place else in my judgment. That's not the question. The question is, how do we determine whether or not they should spend the rest of their lives? Now, I believe in the tribunal process. I think this notion of taking them to New York City is wrong-headed. It creates hugely complex problems for security. See, they're not criminals in my mind. I was a criminal defense attorney. They're not criminals and they're not American citizens. So all the protections we have built in for people who are lawfully here and for our citizens do not inure to their benefit. But they do have a right to be heard. So the notion that they're represented in impartial tribunal, transparent rules of evidence and appeal, that's all they get. But they should have it. They should have it. So it's not where you're going to incarcerate them, it's how do you make that decision. The strength of America is that we finally decided that ourselves, internally. It's taken us a while. And again, I disagree with the Attorney General. This thing could turn into a real circus. They're not criminals, and they're not American citizens. Juxtaposed to Major Hassan. I watched an incredible interview on Fox the other day, and they were talking to a lawyer who had been assigned to him. Now, that's my profession. who was also from the Adjutant General Corps, so he was a military lawyer. He's worn the uniform of his country. He's a lawyer, and probably a darn good one. I won't tell you what I thought of some of the questions. Well, how do you feel, the interviewer said, about representing somebody that's done such a horrible act? He was cool. He was cool. He said, I used to wear the uniform, I'm going to paraphrase, I used to wear the uniform of the country. We've had hundreds of thousands of men and women die going overseas to make sure that we have due process in this country. And so not only do I view that as a lawyer, as my profession, I view it because I wore the uniform. Because one of those things we fight for is that value system, which is part of our brand. I thought it was a brilliant question. Brilliant answer. I thought it was one of the dumbest questions I've ever heard. But of course, it was probably more about ratings than input. Probably more about kind of throwing meat to the beast. He will get a criminal trial. He is an American citizen. Branding. I had an evening one night with my counterpart in Germany. Wonderful man. Otto Schille. I mentioned this encounter in my book. Wonderful man. Lawyer. Pro-American lawyer. Pro-American because the Americans liberated his village during World War II. Forever grateful. By the way, he represented political terrorists in Germany during the 60s. They had a lot of political activism, a lot of terrorists there. And he said to me, I don't know where he was going, what are you doing about Guantanamo? I knew where he was going. He's a lawyer. And it was a reminder to me that the rest of the world will hold us to a higher standard that we have been preaching to the rest of the world for 200 years. That we are different, that we are unique, that part of our branding is our value system, and part of that value system is due process. Now, he didn't think we ought to try them in criminal court. He just said you need a transparent process, let them be heard, make a decision, and move on. That's what we're doing. Of course, I just don't think we ought to be doing it in New York City because it could turn into a circus. And they don't deserve all the protections of our criminal justice system. They're not criminals. They're terrorists. And they're not citizens. But I'm not the Attorney General. He made the decision. The President made the decision. He's my President. We live with the decision. Are we safer? What's the economic impact? Particularly how it relates to our ability to connect with the rest of the world is consistent with the rule of law. One of the biggest challenges that I mentioned, I don't want to run over, I really do want to have the question answered. The Department of Homeland Security was the newest agency for which there was no architecture. 180,000 people from 20 different units of government. 5 or 6 of them were really muscular, were really big, but that was part of the deal. But from the get-go, there was a clash of cultures, and the reason I raise that is because of what happened in Fort Hood. The Cold War mentality within the law enforcement community and the intelligence community during the Cold War was they would share information with their counterparts if they thought their counterparts had a need to know. Great expression. If you need to know, we'll tell you. I had somebody tell one of my chief aides, one of the key people, well, you have, he said to us something, well, you know, we still operate under need to know, and don't worry about it, you're not going to need to know much. Basically saying we're not going to tell you much. And we said not only do we need to know, we may need to share. A certain bias I brought into it as a governor because I don't think you can secure the country from inside the Beltway. We're going to have the 50 governors as our partners, big city mayors as our partners, police chiefs, fire chiefs. It's not that they would see the threat matrix I get every day. I used to start every day, walk out of the house, down to the car. First thing I got was a briefing book. All the new threats over the past 24 hours. I miss not knowing. Not something you'd feel good about necessarily, but I do miss being out of the loop. Now, most of them were incredible, but you know, and the incredible ones I never saw. So I miss not knowing. I remember one time we're in the Oval Office. That's how the day went. Down, read a briefing, have the briefing CIA, have DHS briefing, go in, wait outside the Oval Office. The President and Chief of Staff would wave us in. The President's already been there for 45 minutes to an hour. He's had read his briefing books, has had his session with Dr. Rice. with the CIA director. They've talked about global, international matters, not just terrorism. Then either Andy would see his arm around the door, we'd see his countenance, he'd wave us, come on in, we'd go in. General Ashcroft and I would rearrange the furniture, plop down, we'd have the discussion. One time, a couple times happened where Bob Mueller, who's a great patriot, a tremendous director of the FBI, briefed the president on something of which I was unaware. Not a good thing. So I said to Bob afterwards, it's not a good thing. And listen, he said, it's not about his leadership. He said, well, from now on, you send one of your aides over, they can sit in on my briefing so you know what I know. Good, we corrected that problem. But it was the bottom, lower level, the clash of cultures. I want to only get the information, I want to share it. Think about what happened at Fort Hood. All I'm doing is reading the press accounts. I have no inside knowledge. The Joint Terrorism Task Forces that the FBI has constructed in major urban areas, JTTFs. The news reports say that in 2008, I'm not saying that they're accurate, it's just what I read. So you say to yourself, what if they have 15 or 20 emails, or I think they're emails, not telephone conferences, from a major in the military emailing a known radical imam in Yemen. Now, I don't want to jump to conclusions that this is necessarily improper. I have to be somewhat curious. And the way I think I would satisfy my curiosity is to go to the intelligence group within the Department of the Army and inquire if they were aware of that or if there was any professional reason that he was emailing a radical imam. I don't know. Muhammad Atta was taking flying lessons. The FBI was aware of it, but he didn't really, it was kind of interesting. He didn't want to learn how to take off and he didn't want to learn how to land. I don't know whether he got a discount or not. May he rest in the darkest, deepest, hottest place. Need to know. Need to share. The peer group, his peer group in the hospital, had some questions about his service in Walter Reed. With whom did they share that? I was on the Virginia Tech panel. Remember that horrible incident where a young man gunned down in a couple of classrooms, quite a few of his fellow students? The same problem. Bits and pieces of information out there. Had they been connected, they would have known that unfortunately they had a very, very troubled young man in their midst. And hopefully they could have interceded and avoided that. But no one had even half the picture, let alone total picture. Need to share. So one of the biggest challenges we had when we built the department was getting information from those who we didn't generate intelligence, we got it, we pulled it in to share it with the govs, the adjutant generals, National Guard, whatever. A couple more observations, we'll conclude. Unfinished business. There's a lot of it I talk about in the book, but let's talk about the broader indication of how we deal with the threat of terrorism. First of all, I always felt the war was misnamed. War on terror. Terrorism is a tactic. Terrorism has been used as a tactic to advance a cause for millennia. It's really a war against the belief system, isn't it? President Bush said it right. Small group of people have hijacked a great religion. And they have. So how do you undermine the belief system? Before she died, I had the opportunity, before she was assassinated, I had the opportunity to meet Benazir Bhutto. There was a religious conference in Kiev in the Ukraine. And I thought before I met her, I should read some of her works. I'll never forget the quote. She said that you can exile a man but not an idea. You can imprison a man but not an idea. You can kill a man but not an idea. powerful when you think about it, particularly when the enemy is an idea. So there has to be a military dimension. We can argue about Afghanistan or Iraq. That's up to you if you want to take that discussion. So I'm going to tell you there's got to be a military dimension, not only us, but other countries. We have to face it. It's a global scourge. A lot of other countries have to confront it as well. But what else do we do? Again, our security and prosperity is tied up to how we reach out, integrate, and collaborate with our friends around the world. What I told you, 23, 24%. If I was recommending to President Obama where he'd have given his speech, I wouldn't have taken him to the Arabian Peninsula or to Turkey. I'd have probably taken him to the Philippines or Malaysia, because that's where the greatest population is. We do need to learn a little bit more about that world, about the culture, about its history. So what do we need to do? Well, I'm someone who thinks that we need the help of Muslim leaders, both religious and political, to raise their voices in strong and sustained opposition to the perversion of their belief system. We're not there yet. I'm not sure how hard we tried. I think we need to use foreign aid more aggressively. I think we need to reach out in other ways. We use Radio Free Europe to tear down the wall, to explain to Eastern Europeans what we were about. Again, advocating ourselves and our belief system. There's a lot of things we need to do differently. You can exile, you can imprison, and you can kill a man, not an idea. So we have to think differently about it. I don't know how many of you saw Charlie Wilson's War. I served with Charlie Wilson, never was in the bathtub, don't look at me that way. the hot tub. But I thought there was an interesting scene at the end, when he goes back in front of the intelligence community and he says, all right, we got the Mujahideen out, we supported the Mujahideen, the Russians have gone, now I want just a small piece of those dollars to let's help rebuild Afghanistan. Now, I don't know if I've been successful or not, but there was a void there. And who filled the void? The Taliban. What happened when the Taliban filled the void? They became a safe haven and they became the protector of al-Qaeda. We helped through diplomatic efforts to get the Syrians and others out of southern Lebanon. Since that time, we've maybe channeled $30 or $40 million of foreign aid. Hezbollah, supported by Iran, has channeled in far, far more dollars than that. They have built schools and roads. I know foreign aid isn't very popular in this country. But think how much money we have spent in Afghanistan and will spend, and tell me if a small fraction of that several years ago might have helped to build civic institutions so that the people in that country would themselves fight to defend and protect it against the Taliban and al-Qaeda. I don't know. I wish we would have given it a chance. So we need to listen and learn from what has transpired before. No, foreign aid's not popular. It wasn't when I was in Congress. But right now, there's one issue that's less popular than foreign aid. That's executive compensation on Wall Street, and I don't blame them. So we have to think differently about how we go about undermining the belief system. It's very relevant to our world today and tomorrow. So at the end, I concluded after almost a lifetime of public service that we're strong enough as a country to deal with it. I just remind my fellow Americans and audiences such as this, we will be held to a higher standard because we are America. People do have higher expectations of us, whether you believe it or not. I don't necessarily want Americans to be liked. I do want us to be respected. There are ways we can be respected and then liked. I want us to think differently about how we reach out to the rest of the world. But we'll prevail. Be a couple generations, I think. Never totally eliminate terrorism. It'll be a while. But as I say in the book, we don't live in fear, we live in freedom. But the test of our times wasn't my test. The test for America for the foreseeable future is balance the liberties and freedoms we have against the security needs that we need to preserve, we need to have. Benjamin Franklin, I paraphrase him, once said that those who would surrender liberty and freedom for temporary security deserve neither. I don't think we have to surrender liberty or freedom We just have to be mindful every step of the way that we're doing the right thing, consistent with our brand, consistent with the Constitution, rule of law. I appreciate the opportunity to share these thoughts with you. I'm looking forward to our question and answer period. Thank you very much.